disinformation agent. He was basically a ozone-sniffing sky pilot. But the one thing about Lazar's story that always struck me as something that I couldn't explain was that unlike so many other people in the UFO field, his story never changed. Now, we got to bring another name into the mix at this time. Now, remember, circa 1988, 1989, there were no Art Bells. Art Bell was doing satellite political talk out of his trailer in Pahrump, Nevada. There was no Don Ecker. I did not begin broadcasting until 1991. But there was a guy in Las Vegas, Nevada. His name was Billy Goodman. He had a show called The Billy Goodman Happening. At the time, it was on KVEG, I believe it was 870 in Las Vegas. And after George Knapp's second series on the super secret area known as Area 51, Goodman secured quite a coup by getting Bob Lazar and Gene Huff to come on his program. Now, when all this was happening, off on the wings was John, still extremely active in the UFO field, and up and coming Bill Cooper. Now, when Cooper first surfaced in the summer of 1988, he came on the Paranet bulletin board system, claiming that in the mid-1960s, he was a sailor that was stationed on board a diesel submarine, the USS Tyru. And along about 1966, Cooper claims that while he was on lookout on the bridge of the submarine, of course the sub was surfaced, he and several other people were shocked by a gigantic, and I'm talking about aircraft carrier-sized UFO that he alleges left the ocean, flew up into the sky through some clouds, and then either it came back or another one almost identical to it came back. In essence, that was the original story that Cooper gave out. However, as time went by, the story began to change. Soon he was talking about having been part of a ultra-secret naval briefing team in Sinkpak Fleet in the early 1970s, circa 1972, 1973. And he alleges that while he was part of this briefing team, that he, in fact, was privy to some of the most ultra-top cosmic secret things in American intelligence. And these were to include items like something he later called Operation Majority, which in fact was, in hindsight, a ripoff of Bill Moore's MJ-12 documents that Moore claims to have been privy to. And even later, one of the most corrosive pieces of disinformation to come out of that era of time, involving the John F. Kennedy assassination and allegations that actually it was Kennedy's Secret Service driver that fired the fatal headshot. Now, if you're not familiar with this piece of disinformation propaganda, its genesis actually goes back to this period of time. I've got to mention another name, a man by the name of Lars Hansen. Now, Hansen for years had been a fringe researcher, investigator, looking at some really odd and off-the-wall things. But he became involved in the John F. Kennedy assassination. He was working with a couple of guys in Northern California that had a theory that the driver of JFK's limousine in Dallas on that fateful day of November the 22nd, 1963, was somehow involved in the murder of President Kennedy. Now, they didn't have a lot of money. they were able to secure a very poor copy of the Zapruder film, probably what Hansen later told me was a fourth or fifth generation copy. They got it into a lab. They washed all the Keller out of the Zapruder film because, as you may or may not know, the Zapruder film originally was Kellerized. What they were trying to do was to enhance the contrasts in this poor generational copy of the Zapruder film. And while they were doing all this and putting it together and taking a look at it, for just a sudden split second, it appears as if the driver is sitting there holding a pistol, a handgun. Now, I know this is radio. It's tough to imagine this if you haven't seen that video. I do have a copy of this video, which incidentally is titled Dallas Revisited. But some little known facts about this, if you were around then or if you heard about this later. This video was never, ever to have been in the public arena. When Hansen had this done and he put some narration on it, basically what he wanted to do was to find some investors to basically finance his and his two friends' research into the JFK assassination. Now, back in those days, there were a lot of people that were banging around the periphery of the JFK murder. People like Bob Groden, David Lifton, incidentally, people that Lars Hansen knew. And then one of the biggest mistakes ever. Hansen had been in Las Vegas, saw a brochure listing a public talk that John Lear, son of aviation genius William Lear, was giving on his UFO research. And Hansen went down there thinking that if he could interest Lear in this, Lear, whom at the time Hansen believed was part of the Lear fortune, might be persuaded to finance his research, not being aware at the time that Bill Lear and John Lear had had a major falling out before Bill Lear's death, and Bill Lear had cut John from the family fortune. Well, he got down there, met Lear, told him who he was, and gave Lear a copy of this tape. Now, things were to get even more interesting, talking about Bill Cooper. All this time, Cooper's story kept increasing in size and scope. Now he was a former intelligence briefer, which incidentally, in 1990, I did an extensive research and expose on Cooper, which is one of the reasons that we're sitting here today talking about this. And I found out that if Cooper had been part of anything having to do with the briefing team, it was in the audio-visual section of it, which meant, in essence, that what he did was carry out the full ashtrays and carry in the pots of coffee. But be that as it may, later I was to talk to a number of people about Cooper's background. One of the people that I interviewed was former Las Vegas Bullet reporter Mr. Tony Pelham. And I interviewed Pelham about Cooper and his story. And this is what Pelham had to say.
On Cooper's second trip up here a couple of years ago to Lear's house. And as you know, you might not know, I was
You were a reporter for the Las Vegas Bullet.
Tabloid, right. And I saw John doing these lectures. And I said, wait a minute, John, he's a wealthy, intelligent guy. So I went up, introduced myself, and said, John, I want to write about this. But I said, either I'm going to write that you're a kook, or I want to retrace everything you've done so I'll understand about the little graves and the underground bases and all that. So I started reading and tracing down leads and got involved with Linda Howe and mutilated cows. And so one morning John called me and said, hey, I got a guy from the Navy up here. I want you to come up here right away. You got to. I went up, introduced himself as Cooper. He talked for about 2 hours and explained his whole story from 1972 when he saw these documents, the briefing team, and so forth. So I went back and I tried to absorb this, and then I started talking with Cooper on the phone. And he gave us this name of Bob Swan. And Lear had been over to Hawaii since then, and he wasn't able to get a hold of this Bob Swan, but he said he was a building contractor over there. I kept calling until I finally got Bob Swan on the phone. And I introduced myself, and Swan concurred. He said, yeah, he says, I was Bill Cooper's closest friend in 72. It was the night of the eve of the wedding. Bill Cooper came to me and said, hey, I've got these documents.
Now, let me ask you a question, Tony. When was this that you spoke to Bob Swan? Do you remember the ballpark date? Because I have a reason for asking this. Because
have you seen Linda Howell's book, The Alien Harvest?
Oh, Linda and I, see, I'm a mutilation researcher myself.
Okay, well, what I was going to say was, it was, as soon as I got a hold of him, it was that following, and I told Linda, and I gave her his phone number, she got a hold of him, and then that letter that Swan sent her, whatever that date is, it would have been about 2 to 3 months prior to that when I talked to him.
So we're talking roughly September, October 1988.
Right. So that's when I talked to Swan. Swan, I was impressed. He was legit. He says, yeah, and he seemed to be a very successful building contractor over there, and he goes from island to island. And so I said, did you know? Yeah, he says, but Bill came to me with these documents. He said he had these documents. He was talking about the astronauts and the UFOs and that. He says, I can tell you up front, he says, I never accepted these documents. He says, first of all, he says, if Bill had some top secret stuff, he said, as a civilian, I didn't want to have anything to do with, he says, because that's against the law, and he says, I figured our government knew what they were doing. But he said, yeah. The only thing he would talk about was that, yeah, John said it was talking about there was a base on the other side of the moon and that our astronauts had been followed by UFOs. That was the extent of it. There was none of this Kennedy stuff or any of that stuff. So I said, what did you do? He said, listen, I didn't get any documents. He says, John, Bill never gave me any documents. He said he had some papers there, but he says, I don't even know that I actually looked at them. He says, I just didn't want to be involved. He says, but Bill did seem to be very concerned about the whole thing.
Now, wait a minute now, Tony. Let me make sure I get this straight, okay? I want to get this absolutely correct. Bob Swan told you that the only thing he recalled was that Cooper had mentioned something about UFOs following the astronauts up to the moon, and allegedly there was an alien base on the dark side of the moon.
That was the extent of it. No, and I talked to him for about a half an hour on the phone. He says, up front, he says, well, listen, he says, even though Bill's been out of the Navy all these years, he says, I don't even know if I should be talking about it. He says, because couldn't he still get in a lot of trouble about this? I said, well, no, because Bill Cooper is advertising and trying to tell the world all this stuff. So I said, but we're trying to verify if he's a phony or if any of this stuff actually happened. But so then when I put him in touch with him and Linda Howell in touch, he wrote her this letter that she published in her book. If you read the book very carefully, it doesn't really say any more than what I've said.
No, I as a matter of fact, not only have I read the book, I reviewed the book for UFO Magazine.
Okay, well then you see that still we've seen no documents. Then, when I started spending my time with Bill Cooper, and mind you, the reason I maintain the relationship the way I do, and it took me as long as George Knapp had asked me a long time ago to do that interview, and I finally reluctantly did it. I'm not a ufologist. I'm not in any different segment or faction of this thing. I'm a curious person, so I maintained a relationship with Bill Cooper when he put into talking about Fatima, and when this Galileo was launched and they're going to shoot plutonium to them. I go along with all this. I never looked at Bill Cooper and said, Bill, you're full of shit, or I don't believe this. I keep the lines of communication open,
right,
so people will tell me as much as they'll tell me. So when he insisted about the documents, I said, well, Bill, I said, as a reporter, I want to verify all this. He says, well, great. He says, this is what I've been looking for, a reporter, somebody that can verify my background. He gave me that resume of those 6 previous employers. I called all 6 of them up, and I could only verify like 2 of them, and it was like, some little training school or something, like where people go to. In other words, it wasn't like he's the president of some university in California or something. I mean, the people did remember him, and then